Hi, this is a small talk for the IPWEA-Q Wastewater Treatment mini-conference. And my name's Rob Fearon. I'm from Queensland Water Directorate. We're a business unit of the IPWEA-Q. There's a little bit of information there. I won't dwell on that. We've got a number of programs, and one of the key ones is called SWEAP, the Sewage and Water Environmental and Advisory Panel, and we work a lot with councils across Queensland on ways to improve sewage management and treatment. The mini-conference today is a great example from a number of councils on the ways that they're improving their sewage treatment and how it's changed over time. So I didn't want to bore you with a whole lot of history, but gave you a few dates there. Sewage removal has been around for a long time, for centuries, but sewers themselves are really linked to sewage treatment, and they haven't been around for that long, only about 100 years. And in Queensland, really, sewerage only started strongly in the 60s and 70s. There were sewers in Brisbane before that, but that was when the rest of Queensland really ramped up their sewerage, as you can see on the map there. That was really driven by environmental regulation, and indeed the very first environmental regulation ever was in England, in London, when the sewage going past the Houses of Parliament in the Thames smelt so bad that the parliamentarians decided to do something about it and enacted the first environmental legislation. Environmental legislation in Queensland started in the 60s and 70s, and it's been strongly focused on how to remove nutrients. So the history of sewage treatment has found that the things that people are mostly worried about, so the odour that I mentioned, and of course the germs, aren't that hard to remove compared to the nutrients, which can cause a lot of problems if they're discharged directly to waters. So there's been a trade-off for many years based on the cost of sewage treatment, both the initial capital costs, the ongoing operational costs, and in particular, in the OPEX, the skills that are needed to run plants. The more advanced plants, they need more advanced skills and a greater number of operators in general. And that trade-off's been with nutrients. So carbon generally gets treated fairly easily with sediments, but nitrogen and phosphorus, particularly nitrogen, are much harder to remove, and they take a fair bit of cost. So you've always got this tension. So nitrogen and phosphorus are key drivers of cost because most licences for sewage treatment plants specify nitrogen and phosphorus limits. Nitrogen is probably the key driver there, and you can see that CapEx, as you would expect, doesn't scale linearly. It's more expensive per EP per equivalent person to build smaller plants, but OPEX also scales in the same sort of way. So the smaller plants don't have the economies of scale of the large plants for both CapEx and OPEX. So nitrogen really drives costs for modern sewage treatment plants, and this has been brought to the fore in the Great Barrier Reef because in the recent years there's been a strong emphasis by the federal and state government and local governments right across Queensland to help protect the reef, and the latest science shows that in the priority order the most important things are climate change first, and then runoff, particularly nutrients and particularly nitrogen, which has been identified as a key threat. So because climate change is difficult to address at small scales, the state government is focused on building resilience of the reef by addressing threats from runoff, particularly dissolved inorganic nitrogen. And you can see that the catchments of the Great Barrier Reef have been rated based on their concentrations of DIN, dissolved inorganic nitrogen, and nitrogen's become a key driver. So nitrogen is a particular problem because most of it comes to sewage treatment plants through food and through urine and feces. A lot of that nitrogen is actually produced is human-made nitrogen drawn from the air through a very expensive Haber-Bosch process, and 80 to 90% of it's used for fertilisers, so those fertilisers eventually end up getting eaten and end up in the sewage treatment system. That process, the Haber-Bosch process, consumes around 2% of global energy and 5% of natural gas production, and you can see that the production's only going up, as is the cost. So nitrogen has a high embedded cost and a high embedded cost for energy as well, so high embedded energy. Phosphorus kind of similar. Production's gone up, and the major source for phosphate nowadays is phosphate rock, and the major source of phosphate rock is Morocco. So there are mines all around the world, but Morocco really has the big reserves. Some scientists are arguing that we'll reach a point called peak phosphorus, like peak oil, where the production rate of phosphorus, represented by the dots in this graph, will actually peter out, because we've assessed all of the easy to reach phosphate rocks, and the supply will decrease, which will raise prices even more. The point is that both nitrogen and phosphorus have an inherent cost and inherent energy value. So when you're thinking about sewage treatment, you've got to be thinking about the costs, not only in terms of removal of nutrients, but the cost to greenhouse gas production. So the sewage treatment process itself can release carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide, depending on how it's managed and what sort of plant you have. In fact, every part of the water cycle has its own embedded and direct release of these various greenhouse gases. And that really needs to be taken into account, particularly for the reef, because if you remember, climate change was the key cause. There's no point removing all the nutrients if the reef is being damaged by climate change faster than it is by nutrients. So that increases our trade-off considerations. It can't anymore be between costs and nutrient removal. You've got to consider your direct greenhouse gas production, so things like the power that's going into the process in the treatment site, and also increasingly in Queensland and around the world, the use of on-site renewables, particularly solar, to help drive your on-site processes and perhaps produce external energy. And then your external GHG or Scope 3 emissions, so the things like the costs, the embedded costs of steel, concrete and chemicals, but in particular the water and the nitrogen and phosphorus. So to get the water to the SDP takes a lot of money and energy, so that water itself, as well as the nutrients in it, has an embedded cost. But it's more complex than that too, because increasingly we're thinking about, and there are increasing examples in Australia, of energy capture from sewage, including methane, but also heat, microhydro, and increasingly now focus on hydrogen production. At the same time, there's increasing concern about contaminants, not just the metals and pesticides that have always been an issue, but increasingly PFAS, microplastics, personal care products. Those contaminants are emerging concern. So really, design of sewage treatment now has to take into account a whole range of aspects, and some of the talks that are in this mini conference touch on many of those aspects, showing that Queensland councils are in the fore of considering these sort of processes. So I wanted to have just a quick check-in. 25 years ago when I joined the water industry, I was told that the treatment process were going to change so markedly that everyone would have to retrain and have new jobs in the future, and that's just not been the case, partly because we've got so many plants. You can see them dotted green over Queensland there, partly because plants are made to last a long time, 50 to 100 years, I guess, but at least 40 years for many plants. And also because new technology is expensive. So there have been increases in technology and improvements, and that has required vast changes in the way operators do their work, but that hasn't been widespread on a statewide or nationwide basis. And another part of the reason is there's a whole lot of options there for how you can do your sewage treatment. And that's how I want to finish the talk, just talking about how some of those options can be considered. So one way we thought of talking about those different trade-offs is with one of these sort of spider graphs. So it has the different criteria around the edge. So here's your GHGs, direct and external, nutrients and cost as a trade-off, contaminants, and the capture of energy from the sewage. So this would be a target or ideal or best case guess. So you've found out ways to remove as many GHGs as possible, as many nutrients as possible. You're capturing contaminants, probably not all of them, probably will never be able to do that. Again, with the energy, probably can't capture all of it, do a fair bit there. There's always going to be a cost though. Let's compare that with, say, a idealised high-tech plant. So Here, the GHG loads are fairly high because of the steel and concrete, and because you're removing that nitrogen and phosphorus rather than reusing it. Nutrient removal is good. Technology is not capable yet of removing all nutrients, but you can get pretty close. Contaminants is increasing over time, as is capture of energy, but the cost is always going to be pretty high for those plants. Compare that with a low-tech plant, say a trickle filter or an old-fashioned conventional style. The cost is much lower. The embedded and direct GHG are lower because there's not as much energy use. The nutrient is fairly poor, nutrient capture, unless it's very well managed, and contaminants flow through, although these are often in small towns where there's not as many contaminants of emerging concern, and there's not a lot of energy capture in those systems. Both these could be improved if you recycle the water, because then you're reusing that nitrogen and phosphorus and the water, so you're cutting down on some of the saving costs higher up in the water cycle as well. So that's just one way of trying to think of the trade-off between those different criteria, and I think of it as trying to push the envelope of these blue lines out towards this lopsided diamond in the target approach. Of course, this isn't a new idea. A lot of people are talking about how we balance all those needs for STPs, and you'll hear some of those talks in this mini-conference from councils who are leading the way in Queensland. The idea of optioneering was really explored in a partnership project with LGAQ, the Department of Environment and Science, and the Water Directorate, along with Reef councils, to look at how we could encourage consideration of various options when sewage treatment plants were being upgraded. The idea was to look broadly at all options and not just settle for the first one or one that has a really strong benefit in one particular area. It's all available at this website, and one of the things I'll just give you a quick update on is this water treatment options. So we had a comparison of a lot of the criteria that we've been discussing: CapEx, OpEx, nitrogen reduction, the economic and environmental issues. There's a report there available for members down at the bottom, and it's summarised in this graph, which compares the technical, environmental and economic criteria across the top with various different types of options down the bottom. There's a broader report in an Excel sheet for people who want to use it. So the idea of pushing the envelope is being considered by the department, the regulator, as well as the industry, and as well by as many councils and by the sector nationally and internationally. So I guess the key directions for our sector in Queensland are to consider alternative options, to push the envelope and seek co-benefits, engage with regulators, and to maximise your recognition. So if you're getting these co-benefits, we need to be clear that we're serving our communities better in a lot of different ways, because some of those things can be invisible otherwise. Thank you very much.